We ask you just one question. Why do old photographs show extraordinarily tall people 7, 8, even 10 feet or more appearing across different parts of the world, only for that strange trail to fade during the 19th century? What makes these images so fascinating is how ordinary many of them appear. These towering figures are photographed alongside families, workers, soldiers, and entire groups, dressed for everyday life rather than displayed as circus attractions. Then something changes. The photographs become harder to find, the stories grow uncertain, and the trail seems to go cold. So, were these simply tall people? Or have we misunderstood a whole chapter of human history? Well, stay tuned, because in this video we'll show you exactly that. Chapter 1. The giants in the old photographs. Have you ever wondered why certain old photographs seem to show what look like giant human beings? We're talking about the kind of photos where one person isn't only taller than everyone else, they seem almost out of place beside them. 7 feet, 8 feet, perhaps even more. Yet nobody around them appears particularly amazed. That's where things start getting strange. These men aren't always presented as circus attractions or medical curiosities. In several photographs circulated online as historical images, they appear among workers, soldiers, farmers, and families. Their clothes match everyone else's. Their expressions are ordinary. Nobody is pointing at them. Nobody seems frightened. They're simply there. One supposed photograph from Siberia shows 3 men beside an enormous doorway. 2 appear fairly ordinary in size, while the third seems tall enough to nearly reach the upper frame. Another widely shared image, said to show railroad workers on the American frontier, appears even stranger. Several men seem to tower over their companions. Yet the scene looks less like a performance and more like the end of a tiring workday. Of course, old photos can deceive us. Perspective, unusual camera angles, altered images, incorrect dates, and misleading captions can turn something ordinary into something extraordinary. And exceptionally tall people have always existed. But there's another detail that keeps pulling us back. Once these photographs are gathered together, they seem to tell a much larger story, one filled with unusually tall people, oversized doors, enormous buildings, and a world that somehow feels slightly different from the one we know today. Then, as the 19th century moves forward, that strange visual trail seems to fade. And around the same period, another name begins disappearing from maps and historical records: Tartaria. Maybe the connection means nothing. Maybe these photographs have perfectly ordinary explanations that became distorted over time. But if even a handful of them are genuine, one question becomes difficult to shake. Where did all those giants go? Chapter 2. The mud flood and the missing guardians. That question becomes even harder to ignore once we turn away from the people and look at the cities themselves. Across places like Chicago, Seattle, Sacramento, and parts of Europe, older buildings can still be found with windows below modern street level, entrances reached by descending stairs, and former lower floors that now function as basements. There are documented reasons for several famous examples. Chicago raised large sections of its streets during the 19th century to improve drainage. Seattle rebuilt parts of its downtown at a higher level after the Great Fire of 1889. Sacramento also raised streets as protection against repeated flooding. Those events are real. The controversial part begins when separate examples are placed together and treated as evidence of something much larger. The so-called mud flood, an alleged 19th century catastrophe that buried portions of an earlier civilization. Mainstream geology and history do not recognize evidence for such a worldwide event. But the theory has survived because the buildings themselves can look remarkably strange. Tall windows disappear beneath sidewalks. Decorative stonework continues below present ground level. Doorways seem unnecessarily grand for ordinary human proportions. Photographs of street-raising projects sometimes resemble cities being excavated rather than rebuilt. And this is where our giants return to the story. Suppose, purely for the sake of following the theory, these unusually large buildings belong to the same world as those unusually tall people. Suddenly, their disappearance becomes more than a question of human height. Perhaps they were connected to the structures themselves, not merely living among them. But understanding systems later generations no longer knew how to use. That possibility sits at the heart of another Tartaria claim, that certain monumental buildings were machines as much as architecture. Domes, towers, metal spires, elaborate water systems, and huge interior chambers have been interpreted by supporters as remnants of forgotten technology, including atmospheric electricity and acoustic systems. There is no accepted evidence that these structures produced free energy, and their known architectural purposes offer far less dramatic explanations. Still, within the theory, the giants take on a fascinating role. They become the missing guardians, not guards standing outside palace doors, but people carrying practical knowledge how certain structures worked, why they were designed that way, what their unusual features actually did, and how to maintain them. A building can survive its builders for centuries. Knowledge is much easier to lose. Remove the people who understand a complicated system, and eventually all that remains is the shell. Later generations repair it, rename it, divide its rooms, seal unwanted entrances, turn lower levels into basements, and give unfamiliar features new purposes. Which leaves us with a far more troubling possibility. Perhaps the mystery isn't simply why the giants disappeared. Perhaps it's what disappeared with them. It's not as simple as we like to believe. Chapter 3. Erasing giants from history. If knowledge disappeared with those supposed guardians, another problem follows. How could people that remarkable simply vanish from history? The 19th century certainly knew extraordinarily tall humans. Newspapers wrote about them, crowds paid to see them, doctors examined them, and photographers preserved their faces. Anna Haining-Swan of Nova Scotia reportedly reached around 7 feet 11 inches. Her husband, Martin Van Buren Bates, stood roughly 7 feet 9 inches, and together they became one of the most famous, exceptionally tall couples of their time. Duard Beauport, the Canadian strongman born in 1881, eventually grew beyond 8 feet. So enormous people were real. There is nothing mysterious about admitting that. The trouble begins when genuine history becomes mixed with photographs carrying extraordinary claims that cannot be traced back to reliable originals. That happens constantly online. An old picture appears showing an enormous worker beside ordinary men. Another supposedly captures a giant soldier. Someone adds a date, a town, perhaps even a dramatic story about where the photograph was discovered. Within months, dozens of websites repeat the same information until repetition starts feeling like proof. Then someone searches for the original archive. Nothing, no photographer, catalog number, or newspaper report from the period. Sometimes even the supposed location cannot be confirmed. And photographic deception is hardly new. Long before Photoshop, 19th century photographers understood double exposure, forced perspective, combination printing, retouching, and other techniques capable of producing astonishing scenes. Giants were particularly profitable subjects because sideshow culture had already made the public fascinated by unusual bodies. Some pictures were authentic portraits of exceptionally tall performers. Others exaggerated size for entertainment. That makes the surviving material frustrating rather than useless. A photograph without provenance cannot tell us what happened before or after the shutter closed. Cropping can remove useful scale. A later print may lose detail present in an earlier copy. Captions get changed. Dates are guessed. People are misidentified. After enough reproductions, an authentic photograph can acquire a completely fictional history. But deliberate historical erasure is a much larger claim. For an entire population of giants to have been systematically removed during the 1800s, traces should remain outside photography. Census entries, military enlistments, hospital files, death certificates, family records, clothing, furniture, graves, letters, newspapers, and physical remains. 19th century documentation certainly contains gaps, fires, wars, poor preservation, changing bureaucracies, and simple neglect destroyed enormous amounts of material, but missing records alone cannot prove somebody intentionally removed them. Well, now, that leaves us in a much stranger position than either side usually admits. We know exceptionally tall humans walked through this period. We know photographers recorded them. We also know photographs could be manipulated, mislabeled, exaggerated, or stripped of their original context. What we do not have is verified evidence that an entire race of giants was erased. But the stories refuse to die. Perhaps that persistence tells us something important. History does not always disappear because somebody burns the evidence. Sometimes it changes slowly, one missing caption, one altered reproduction, one exaggerated story at a time, until nobody remembers where the original ended and the legend began. And if we can no longer tell which giants were actually real and which were manufactured, perhaps the most interesting disappearance wasn't physical at all. It was the disappearance of certainty. Chapter 4. A world built for giant certainty may be gone, but stone is harder to argue with. Walk through the monumental architecture of the 19th century, and an uncomfortable question eventually follows you through the door. Why did people build on such an enormous scale? Take the Palace of Westminster. After fire destroyed much of the old complex in 1834, Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin helped shape the extraordinary building seen today. Its Victoria Tower rises roughly 323 feet, while the interiors are filled with soaring ceilings, vast halls, enormous windows, and doorways that can make a person seem strangely small. Then there is the Royal Palace of Caserta in Italy. Completed over generations from the 18th century onward, the complex contains around 1,200 rooms, monumental staircases, immense corridors, and spaces deliberately designed to overwhelm anyone entering them. St. Peter's Basilica pushes that sensation even further. Its interior reaches roughly 448 feet in length, while the dome rises more than 400 feet above the floor. Everything is so carefully enlarged that judging its true size from photographs can become surprisingly difficult. There is no historical mystery about why these places were built this way. Churches used height to inspire awe. Palaces displayed wealth and authority. Railway stations required huge open interiors. Government buildings turned architecture into a public statement. Large doors also had practical uses, including ceremonies, crowds, carriages, ventilation, and moving oversized objects. Still, when giant theories enter the conversation, those explanations begin competing with a far stranger possibility. Supporters point toward doors reaching far above ordinary heads, windows beginning several feet from the floor, huge staircases, elevated fixtures, and decorative features placed where reaching them would require ladders or scaffolding. Their argument is simple. Perhaps certain structures feel oversized because their original occupants were oversized too. That idea becomes even more ambitious around domes, cupolas, towers, and metal spires. Alternative history communities have proposed that these features once collected atmospheric electricity or formed parts of forgotten energy systems. Similar claims surround acoustics, water circulation, and the unusual resonance produced inside large stone chambers. No reliable evidence currently shows that Tartarian buildings functioned as free energy machines, and historians can explain these architectural elements through known engineering, religious symbolism, ventilation, lightning protection, acoustics, and decoration. But there is still something fascinating underneath the speculation. Old technology often becomes mysterious when its purpose is forgotten. A medieval murder hole becomes decoration to someone unfamiliar with castles. Ancient Roman hippocausts can resemble strange underground tunnels until their heating function is understood. Even ordinary mechanical systems become meaningless once the people who knew how to operate them are no longer around. So suppose the giant theory is followed one step further. A person 8 or 9 feet tall would experience monumental architecture very differently. High controls would become reachable. Large steps would feel smaller. Enormous furniture would become practical. Features we currently consider excessive might suddenly fall within comfortable human proportions. That does not prove giants designed these places. Far from it. But it changes the question. Perhaps searching for enormous skeletons is only one way believers have approached this mystery. Architecture offers another, because buildings preserve proportions long after names and stories disappear. And if someone truly wanted to erase the memory of an earlier population, destroying every structure would hardly be necessary. Keep the buildings. Change their purpose. Give unfamiliar features ordinary explanations. Then, allow generations to grow up inside them until nobody thinks to ask who they were originally meant for. Because after enough time passes, even something enormous can become completely normal. Chapter 5. The knowledge that disappeared with them because buildings can outlive the people who understood them. Perhaps the final question was never really about height, it was about knowledge. History has already shown us how easily knowledge can disappear. The recipe for Roman marine concrete was poorly understood for centuries, even while ancient harbor structures remained standing underwater. Greek fire terrified enemy fleets during the Byzantine era, yet its precise formula never survived in a form we can confidently reproduce. Damascus steel became legendary for blades with remarkable patterns and properties, while the original methods behind certain historical examples faded as materials and manufacturing traditions changed. Even something as ordinary as construction can become difficult to recover once a craft tradition breaks. That matters here. Modern civilization often treats progress like a staircase. Each generation steps higher than the one before it. But history behaves more like a road filled with detours, collapses, rediscoveries, and forgotten paths. The Romans developed sophisticated aqueducts, underfloor heating, enormous concrete structures, and water systems that continued functioning for centuries. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed, parts of that engineering tradition declined or became less widely used in Western Europe. Humanity did not become less intelligent. The chain carrying particular skills simply broke. And that possibility gives the giant story its most interesting question. If an earlier population really possessed specialized knowledge, removing those people would accomplish something far greater than removing their bodies. Their experience would vanish with them. A written description can preserve instructions, but it cannot always preserve judgment, the little decisions learned through years of practice, the sound indicating something is wrong, the correct pressure of a hand, or the technique a master teaches an apprentice without ever putting it on paper. Within Tartaria theories, this is where the so-called guardians become important. Believers argue that monumental structures, domes, towers, spires, unusual acoustics, and water systems belong to a technological culture whose real purpose was later forgotten. Claims involving free atmospheric energy remain unsupported by accepted historical or scientific evidence, and no verified record establishes giants as operators of such systems. Still, the broader idea of technological loss is anything but fantasy. Knowledge really does die. Languages disappear when their final speakers pass away. Crafts vanish when nobody learns them. Machines become useless when replacement parts and technicians no longer exist. Entire methods can shrink from everyday practice into something understood by only a handful of specialists. Perhaps that is why these stories continue pulling people back. Not because every enormous doorway proves a giant walked through it. Not because every strange photograph reveals a suppressed race. And certainly not because every missing document points towards somebody deliberately rewriting the past. The fascination comes from knowing that history genuinely contains losses. We have already watched civilizations rise, fracture, abandon cities, forget scripts, change religions, reuse monuments, and build new lives over the remains of older ones. The Maya script itself resisted modern understanding for generations before major breakthroughs in decipherment finally allowed researchers to recover voices that had effectively been silent for centuries. So when we encounter something whose purpose is unclear, curiosity is not unreasonable. Certainty is where we should be careful. Maybe the giants circulating through old photographs are misunderstood performers, unusually tall individuals, altered pictures, or people distorted by perspective. Maybe Tartaria was simply a geographic label Europeans once used for vast and poorly understood regions of Asia, rather than the forgotten global empire described online today. Maybe those enormous 19th century buildings were designed for symbolism, ceremony, ventilation, crowds, horses, machinery, and the human desire to make architecture feel magnificent. Those explanations have evidence behind them. But they do not make the larger question any less haunting. How much knowledge has humanity already possessed and lost? How many techniques disappeared because the last person carrying them died before anyone thought to record them? How many objects sit inside museums today with labels beginning with words such as possibly, probably, or unknown? Maybe there was never a worldwide civilization of giants guarding forgotten machines. Maybe there was. At present, the evidence cannot carry us that far. But history has left enough unanswered questions to make curiosity worthwhile. And after everything we have followed, from strange photographs to buried streets, monumental buildings, forgotten technologies, and stories that refuse to disappear, we are left with something far more interesting than an easy answer. Not simply, where did the giants go? But, what did humanity once know that nobody remembers anymore? Well, that's all from us. If you've enjoyed watching this video, be sure to give it a like, share it, and hit that subscribe button. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon.